as how can parents assess the seriousness of a problem? How do you know how serious something is? For example, I had someone ask me as part of this panel, if my child says the word suicide or says, I want to die, or I can't do this anymore, how does a parent know, is this a red flag or not?
You really look for context. What is the context that these statements are being made? We always encourage parents to not be shy about following up on those questions. People and kids often use some of these statements as just the expression. We've probably, many of us, had said something desperate at a moment when you're in the moment, and kids are not any different than that. So it doesn't necessarily signal significant risk, but we do want to understand the context. We do want to follow up with questions like, when you said that earlier, you were really upset, but I wonder, do you ever have these thoughts at other times? Do you ever think about this, even when you're not upset or we're not in the middle of an argument? Getting a sense of what else is going on with your child, right? Is this coming at a time when you're having other red flags present or other concerns about how they've been doing or how they've been functioning? In general, I think kids change, right? It's expected that they're gonna change through their development and through their trajectory, and sometimes with teenagers, it is hard to know what is the general moodiness or attitude of a teenager, or does this signal more? But we do need to take beyond the behaviors of what we see in front of us, look at how they're functioning academically, in classes in school, how they're doing behaviorally in school, how they're doing socially, both in school and outside of school, how they're doing with other family members other than us, other adults, other contexts, and that sort of overall picture and context will guide what a statement like this may be.
I also think that asking the question, so that idea, like when we talk about kind of trying to decrease the stigma surrounding talking about mental health, I think sometimes parents or teachers in my school have that concern, like they said that, but I don't think they really meant it. But if everybody feels equipped to really ask the question, I think it also sends the message to your child that you're capable of handling their answer and that you really heard them and that you're really listening. So when they say something like that, it opens up the opportunity to find out the context of why they said what they said. But if you can send the message that you're prepared to hear the answer, whatever it is. So I remember last year, I think it was, we did a panel together, and we had some students from our school on the panel, and they talked about the idea that oftentimes students will say to me when I'm asking those tough questions, I don't want to be a burden, and I don't want my parents to worry, which can be a concern to mental health professionals because feeling like a burden can sometimes go along with some other, feelings of depression and things like that. So I think if you can send the message that you're really prepared for the answer and that you can handle it, I think sometimes, I don't know if it's all kids, but I think that a lot of teenagers are really worried about causing more stress for their families. So I think when you have those questions, it can also send the message that you're ready to hear their answers.
And I think it's okay. Teenagers can be a little dramatic in the way they express themselves. Some people may say that's an understatement, that's all right. But I think it's really important to give them an alternative way of expressing it, right? Yeah. So instead of saying, I'm gonna kill myself, to ask them, like, how are you feeling right now? I'm really sad. Okay. So when you say I'm really sad, I'm all in, I'm listening to hear. When you say I wanna kill yourself, I'm wondering if I need to take you to the hospital. So now here's a distinction. Which one is going on? And I think it's really important to give them alternative language that we really listen to, right? So if you teach your kids to say, I'm really sad, then tell me about it, right? You sit down, you don't just sit down when they threaten to kill themselves, right? We really have to be there and present and teach them to use language that isn't as scary when they're not actually thinking about hurting themselves.
Just to chime in, that's a really heavy conversation for you as parents, right? Like we have mental health professionals in all the schools, social workers, psychologists, counselors. Like you have a conversation like that with your child. The next day you're like, wow, that was heavy. I'm not sure where to go. Call social worker, call psychologist. If you have a relationship with one of them, great. If not, pick up the phone, give them a call, have a conversation about it, and they can point you in the right direction. If you have a therapist already, great. You can reach out to that person. But you know, there's people to help you through that if you have a conversation like that.
Yeah, or even beforehand to role play it.
Right.
I'm sure you'd be happy to do that, Dan, as a
Yeah.
role play with you guys, how to have that conversation.
The next question I have here is for Dr. Weisenreeder. What does it mean to validate your child, and why is that important?
I think it's kind of consistent with what we were
Yeah.
already talking about.
Mhm.
So validation is really creating a situation where the child is going to feel, or anybody is going to feel heard and understood. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean that you agree with the person, but validating the person is letting them know that you can understand why they're feeling the way they're feeling or thinking the way they're thinking, given the circumstances or the way that they're viewing the circumstances. So even when, and doing so kind of goes along with what we were talking about. It opens up the lines of communication, it maintains a connection, and so it allows you to then, it also kind of, sometimes I call it lowering the volume or like decreasing the intensity of emotion sometimes when you feel validated, like somebody can understand how you're feeling. And sometimes I think, you know, personally, if you're really upset about something and you go to tell somebody and they say, what are you so worried, like what are you so upset about? It's not a big deal, relax, calm down. Those kinds of things often lead you to feel misunderstood and lonely or frustrated. And sometimes maybe it makes you shut down, like, you know what, forget it, I'm not gonna talk to this person, they're not making me feel understood in this moment. Or it can do the opposite sometimes. If somebody's telling you calm down, relax, it might lead you to want to really emphasize the severity of the situation, right? And it can escalate. So sometimes validation is just the first step in a longer process. You know, it's not the end all be all, but it can be the starting point to just, even if you wouldn't necessarily feel the same way that they're feeling in the moment, to be able to say, I can understand why you're feeling that way. You worked so hard on that, you know, or, you know, your friends are so important to you, and when they didn't call you and you saw that picture online, I can understand why that hurt so much, you know. It can kind of just turn the volume down enough to keep the lines of communication open for like a longer conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to point out it is not agreeing with the person, because if you can and should set boundaries and limits. So I can understand that you're angry that you can't play your Xbox anymore, and these are the rules of the house, and this is what we're gonna do, and these are the appropriate ways of expressing your anger, perhaps, if there's behaviors that then result that you know clearly can't agree with. So I think that's a really important distinction, because it's, again, validating the emotion or the feeling that that person is in, and the situation, you know, in the situation and how they're feeling, and not necessarily their behavior, or, you know, it's not agreeing.
Okay, the next section I have is about clinical anxiety, depression, mental illness. Dr. Foyer, I was going to ask you, how can a parent tell if their child is depressed or if their child has a clinically significant anxiety?
Yeah, so we kind of alluded to that earlier about functioning and impact of functioning, but I think it's important to note all of these issues, anxiety, depression, many other problems, it's not you have it or you don't have it, they move along the continuum. And we all have days that we're feeling anxious, or situations that we're feeling anxious in. We all also have stress that can accumulate and cause more problems as chronic stress. And then we, you know, have days that we're sad or upset, and so do our kids. The clinical differentiation, there is a cluster of symptoms that are present, and in terms of the clinical diagnosis, they have to be present, a number of them have to be present, and they have to be present for a certain period of time, and they have to be something that impacts on functioning, like we mentioned earlier, academic, social, family, all of those sort of spheres of a child's life. And for depression, some of those symptoms, and you're probably familiar with them, it can be, feelings of sadness, feelings of hopelessness, not having energy, having poor sleep or lots of sleep, poor appetite, or lots of eating. I think important is hopelessness about the future, not enjoying things one previously enjoyed. I think a really important distinction developmentally between kids, adolescents, and adults with depression is that in kids, it oftentimes doesn't necessarily present as your classic sadness. It oftentimes presents as marked irritability, and also it is more typical to have sleeping a lot and eating a lot than it is for adults, where it's more often disrupted sleep and poor appetite and not eating. And kids have still something we call reactive mood, and reactive mood just means when something good happens, when they're out with their friends, they can look like they're fine. They can have a positive reaction to something good happening in their life, even when they're depressed, but then sink right back into where they were feeling, into the hopelessness and all the negative feelings right after, and it doesn't last. And they will sometimes say that, like, yes, I do sometimes feel okay, but it never lasts. But really impact on functioning. And with anxiety, it's the same idea. It's a continuum. Anxiety disorders are really wide. There's many, many different kinds, and they can manifest different ways. I will again say that with younger kids, anxiety will often look like behavioral problems and other difficulties where it's really underlying anxiety about the situation and an inability to appropriately communicate that, like say, like we said earlier, saying I'm suicidal when I just mean I'm sad or I'm frustrated, or we can have many other examples. But again, it's the same idea of like when it's at a point that it's impacting their life to a point of not being able to function, that's when it becomes a disorder.
Okay. Anyone want to add to?
I think the only thing I would add, because I think the functioning piece is really important, because we all have symptoms.
Yes.
We all have some I certainly do have anxiety, I get sad sometimes, all of that stuff. I think that's really important. I think the other two things to keep in mind, one is a significant change.
Yes.
If you see a significant change in your kid, you want to pay attention to that. So just as a general rule of thumb, it could be a change in behavior, it could be a change in thinking, it could be a change in somatic stuff, whatever it may be, a change in friendships. Like if it's a really significant change that seems to come with some distress, I would pay attention to that, and I would use what you said to open up the lines of communication. And the other thing, and I think you making this point a number of times actually made the point, it's a pattern of behavior.
Yeah.
It's not I had a bad day. It's really a pattern of behavior that you see in multiple settings, with multiple people, in multiple ways that affects functioning with friends, with family, with grades, with sports, with all of that stuff. So I think that's the way to think about it, rather than this symptom or that symptom, but really the patterns of behavior and a big change in some way. Dan, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
I didn't know if you were.
Yeah.
So along those lines, I have this question for Dr. Wise and Rita, but I'm sure all of you can chime into this. How can parents help prevent their child who may have a predisposition for anxiety to not develop an anxiety disorder? Can parents do anything?
So I think, like Dr. Boyer had said, and I'm sure everybody would agree, like so many things, there are biochemical factors, like genetic predisposition, things like that. But I do think that I love to be hope is very important. There's like tons of research on hope, and we have to be optimistic and hopeful that there are certainly things that families can do. So I'm going to touch on what Dr. Boyer had said before about this piece about impaired functioning. Like once it starts to impair a child's functioning in a certain area, I'm going to circle back to that. I think for that families can be so influential about is developing healthy coping skills in general for anxiety, and children learn through, vicariously through hearing you talk through things that are appropriate to share and all of those kinds of things, and how you're thinking about something maybe as a challenge rather than something insurmountable, those kinds of things. I'm a big proponent in my school. We have a wellness center where we're really focused on a lot of proactive kind of upstream things, lifestyle strategies that can really help to cope with difficult feelings. So I think it's important to really emphasize connection. Social connection is really such a protective factor for anxiety and for depression. So really working on the connections within your family or connections that your child has with friends and other organizations and things like that, but also just other lifestyle strategies like exercise and sleep and nutrition. Like nutrition can really have a significant impact on a child's emotional wellness. Sleep for sure is a huge one, and remembering to have fun and getting outside and nature, things like that. But when it comes to that idea, when you were saying how can you try your best to decrease the chances that some anxiety or predisposition towards anxiety will turn into an anxiety disorder, like Dr. Foyer was saying before, it's a list of a number of symptoms for a certain amount of time, but there's that piece about being significantly impaired in your functioning. So one area that I think is a big concern when we're talking about anxiety is when a child's anxiety starts to lead them to avoid certain situations or to want to escape certain situations or to be rescued from situations. And I feel like this is touching on something that we were going to talk about later on in the panel too, but I think it must be very hard for families, when you love your child so much, to watch them in distress. But I think one thing that a family can really do to decrease the chances of something turning into an anxiety disorder where their functioning is impaired is to really look out for times where the anxiety is leading a child to not want to go to school or not participate fully in school or in recreation or with the family, like in all of those areas that are their main areas of functioning. I think that's a place for families to really look for that starting to happen, and then figure out ways with support, and maybe we can talk about it more today, to approach those situations, not in a harsh way necessarily, but that is really key to continue to approach those situations and not escape them and avoid them, because that's when functioning really gets impeded.
Yeah, that's one of the things we've seen. I don't know if you've seen it at Oceanside, but the school avoidance, there's been a real uptick over the last 2 years since COVID with that, where students struggle to get in the building, struggle to leave their house, parents call us, they don't want to leave home, and kind of continuing to work with the school and kind of push them through those situations, carefully and safely and with support is really important.
Yeah, and I think so the building psychological capital, right, is what we're talking about, through all these things, through having kids learn how and modeling for them and teaching them and helping them learn problem solving and other skills that really will help build coping skills, like Nina was mentioning. And then I think the other really important thing is, and we touched on this earlier, is tolerating our own anxiety, because a lot of the times our own anxiety drives us to ask the kind of questions or lead them down a path where we make them believe that maybe a certain situation is not safe, or not, or will be difficult for them. Maybe being looking at our own sort of way of looking at these situations, and how can we learn to tolerate our own anxiety about our children and what we're teaching them about the world, and how dangerous things are in it, I think is an important component as well.
I'm going off the questions a little bit because I was actually wanted to ask you guys, I'm thinking about this. I don't know how familiar you guys are with SPACE. I am not trained in SPACE. It's a new type of therapy where you're working with the parents, not the child. For children that have anxiety disorders, you don't see the children, you only work with the parents. And my understanding is that I could be misquoting the percentage, 90-something% of children with anxiety disorders have parents who are, they don't use the word enabling, but they use a word like that, are supported, accommodating, that's the word. That's the word. So that, they, as if we don't have enough mom guilt, now we're responsible for yeah, 95% of the anxiety
Yeah.
because parents, when the kid doesn't want to go, and the parent has anxiety, the parent's exhausted, the parent has a stress, right? It's like, all right, just stay home this one time kind of thing, or let me move your chair over here so that it's not so difficult for you, or let me
Or we'll
pack
opt
your
out
bag.
of the state exam
Let's opt
because
out.
you don't
Let's
need
do
that
this.
anxiety,
Let's
or
do
you know, it's
all
okay not
these
to go to
things.
sleepaway camp with the school
That's right.
because you're
That's
too
right.
anxious about it, and we're gonna opt out because, you know, I'm gonna be anxious that you don't have your phone and I'm not gonna reach you, and oh my God, what's gonna happen in those 48 hours? So, I mean, I think it's, we all go through it, right? And it's all, I think, just thinking, kind of how are we accommodating, how is our anxiety driving accommodating our kids' anxiety and avoidance, and how is that,
And
you know,
then what I
maintaining it,
mentioned
yeah.
before, what is the message you're sending?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
the message really
Right.
is, I don't think you can handle it.
Yeah, and the world is dangerous. Many times that's the message, right? Like when, you know.
And that's hard right now, right?
Yeah.
To not have those thoughts running around. The other thing, I mean, I agree with you that kids listen to us, but I actually think they watch us more than they listen to us. And
Yeah.
so, you know, sometimes we have to think about our own behavior, kind of what we're showing them. But it is, as you said, really painful if a child is struggling to quote unquote do the right thing as a parent. It's really, really hard. And that's where I think Dan's point about getting support from each other, getting support from, you know, people in the school, because, you know, it is just really, really tough. I've worked with parents in all sorts of ways, as you know, I know Jolie haven't. Working with parents, for example, to, you know, ignore kids when they're engaged in really like whiny and attention-seeking behaviors, to the point where I've gotten on the phone with the parent and the child doesn't know that it's me, but I'm really just walking the parent through it. So to talk to me, focus on me, and you hear the kids screaming in the background, but that doesn't faze us because this is what we do for a living. So get the support you need to do some of the things that everyone is suggesting, because they're not so easy.
And something else that I'm thinking, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of the parents here tonight, I think sometimes also at lots of ages, so I work in a high school during the day, but in my private practice, I've worked with families with, you know, much younger children through elementary school and into high school. And I think that sometimes, in general, in my private practice, I feel like psychology isn't magic, and it really is a lot about education. And so that idea, I'll often say to parents when they're coming with their children, that sometimes children feel like they're under the microscope or there's something wrong with them. And if you can open it up to say, like, I am interested in learning, and to view it more as like an educational experience for parents or guardians and children together, then I think even children at much younger ages can understand what we're talking about. That I hope it relieves some of that gut-wrenching feeling when you know that at least your child is hearing the same thing at the same time, that, like, you know, will build like little ladders to work your way up something that you're really anxious about. And so it's like educating everybody, like we're all on the same team. It's not us pulling a child, but that we're all trying to work our way through. I think that sometimes that can make it a little more like palatable for a family when you can include the child, that this is, you know, I'll talk to younger kids about it, like, what do you think I'm gonna say right now that I shouldn't avoid it, that it's not dangerous? Anytime there's this urge to avoid, the question is this dangerous? And I'm probably gonna suggest there's a way to start approaching it.
Yeah.
But then you don't have to keep the child out of that conversation, like educating them,
And it's, again, what's the message you're sending? Like, if we're destigmatizing all of this, is like, we're getting help, you know, it's also helping them accept it. Because, yeah, absolutely right. I think a lot of the times I hear from kids all the time, right? Well, there's nothing wrong with me, but, you know, why am I the one going to therapy? Where it's like, not me, you know, which may or may not be true.
This next question I have for Dr. Brown. How do I know if my teenager's attitude is within normal limits? And it's not exclusive to teenagers.
No.
This can start early. Is it with like I ask parents, ask me a lot, is that normal the way, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough question. I think that there are these developmental stages that kids go through when they point where it's time for them to start to separate from us, and my experience with that is that it's clunky. Like, it's not gonna be some easy, lovely, linear, like, day by day, they're just gonna start to separate and ask us a little less. It goes like this, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think there are developmental differences, Jolie. I do think that, you know, there's certain ways that a 6-year-old might talk to an adult where we would all say, that's not okay, and we're all gonna get together and make it clear to that child. And then there are times when a 16-year-old is talking to me, my 16-year-old, 17-year-old is talking to me, and when it's in front of other people, I really don't like it, I get really uncomfortable. However, we gotta let some of them fly by, right? If you responded to every potentially disrespectful thing that your teenager said to you, a high percentage of your interactions with them would be conflictual. So I think it's a very difficult thing. I don't have a great answer, except to say that there is a difference between words and behavior. And if you are less reactive and they just keep upping the ante, I would pay attention to that. Yeah. If you have thoughts, focus on that.
I mean, I do think that in general, how parents parent and how the adult-child relationships are now versus when we were kids probably is very different. I think that has changed, the dynamic has changed. Kids are, sort of, in many ways, guide our decisions about everything versus, generations ago, it was the other way around. The adults were sort of driving everything. So I think there is a general shift in that and how they communicate and how they express themselves. Also what they're exposed to from a very young age and what they hear and what their vocabulary is. And how they, what's normalized in terms of how people talk to each other when they're, exposed to all kinds of content online at a very young age. Content we probably, as parents, know a very small sliver of it, and we don't even know what they're exposed to. So I mean, I think that those factors also kind of play in how all of this is expressed.
I don't disagree, and I think we still need to let our kids know when they're
course.
behaving in ways that we don't think are
Sure.
appropriate, right? I mean,
Of
we
course.
could talk,
Of
and this
course.
is why, you're right, we don't.
And you gotta pick your battles.
Right, and you gotta pick your battles, so, and every family has its own values,
Yes.
has its own expectations, and as long as those are transparent, and consistent, I think that's fair, I think that's okay.
I think sometimes, and I think I heard you say this at the last presentation you had, that the students are worse with you, the parents,
Oh,
than they
yeah.
are in school or with others, so it's kind of like, it doesn't make it okay, but if they're keeping it together in school and they're respectful of other people and kind of, as Dr. was saying, kind of picking your battles at home and choosing
Yeah.
what to address, what not to, but have those non-negotiables of like, there's certain things that you cannot get away with and you're not gonna, do that. But often they keep it together during the day and then they take it out, unfortunately for you, when they get home. So.
Cause you're safe.
Yeah, exactly. The reframe on that is that it's because they know they'll be loved, that they're safe.
Okay. I might have to skip over some questions. Well, actually, I'll ask Mr. Doherty, how do the schools respond to a mental health crisis when they occur during the school day? And I know it's probably different with different building levels, but what is a typical response?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, we have one school counselor that rotates between the 3 elementary schools. We have a social worker and psychologist in each elementary building. We have 2 social workers in the middle school, a counselor for each grade level, 5 counselors in the high school, 2 social workers, and a high school psychologist in the high school. So we have mental health staff across all the different buildings. It is going to look different, but typically it would start with a referral to somebody on the mental health team. Let's say a student is in crisis during the day. Counselor, social worker, or psychologist will pull the student down, have a conversation with them. If it's in elementary school, the teacher may need to pull the principal in and have a conversation with them about what's happening. And then the counselor, psychologist, or social worker will use a lot of the techniques that we talked about tonight in terms of trying to calm the student down, trying to validate the feelings, listening, with an ultimate goal of going back to the anxiety piece, trying to reintegrate them back into the classroom, trying to calm them down, trying to get them back into a normal routine. Obviously, if it gets to a level where, you know, they're really upset or they can't function, for the younger students, you know, we'll definitely reach out to the parent, you know, right away. For the older students, we'll try to calm them down in-house a little quicker. If it leads to a point where we need to, you know, have the parent come pick them up, we work with Dr. Fear, which you can talk about in a little bit, the Cohen's Mental Health Center, you know, emergency room that we can send them to if it gets to a level of severe where we feel that the student isn't safe. You know, we may call the parent and refer them to go there. But more often than not, that doesn't happen very often. You know, the counselor, social worker, psychologist is able to calm the student down, reintegrate them back into the classroom, and then we'll reach out to the parent, let them know, you know, what happened that day. Hey, you know, Susie had, you know, a situation today. Here's what we talked about. When she comes home tonight, here's some things you can do to, you know, to support her. Here's how, you know, we're going to communicate with the teachers if it's necessary. But again, that goal of trying to get them back in the, you know, in the classroom. If there's a need for outside therapy, you know, they may make a referral on that.
I could, as a school psychologist, like I know I'm not in this school district, but I am a huge fan of the school mental health partnership with Northwell. So, you know, I know you were talking a lot about in a case where, say, the children are younger or it's an anxiety-based situation, but when I think of crisis too, we think about the times where a child really, or a young adult or a teenager is really expressing some concerning thoughts or feelings that really go into the realm of depression or potential risk for harming themselves or suicidal thoughts. And I am so grateful to have the partnership with Northwell, and I think mental health professionals in schools in general have this piece where, of course, we can, you know, validate the student and ask some of those tough questions. And sometimes when the child answers those questions, their answers really do lead a mental health professional to say that this child needs to be seen today by, you know, a mental health professional for an evaluation for their risk for suicide, or for other dangerous thoughts and things like that. And so sometimes that does lead to the evaluation being in the emergency room if the child really is at risk for being in so much danger that they would need to be admitted to a hospital. But that is relatively rare, and we are so lucky in my school district too to have this partnership like your district does. You're part of
We use
something.
They use the hospital.
Oh, okay.
services.
But that's the thing,
Yeah.
because then in that case it allows for, and you can
Yeah.
talk better
Yeah.
about it than I could.
No,
But
yeah, but it's still, there is an access to an ambulatory, we have a behavioral health urgent care, which is not the emergency department, it's an ambulatory crisis center in the children's hospital also, and we have the emergency department, so there is an access to a child psychiatrist to, you know, help in an evaluation and an assessment for what the immediate needs are, and whether that student is safe or needs the hospital, or if they need referrals to other care. So the service would happen, the team would refer the student to the children's hospital, either depending on how severe the cases or what the hours are, but how severe, depending on the ambulatory service, or to the ER if it requires a pediatrician to see the patient, or requires blood work, or at that medical exam, and then they go to the emergency department.
But I know that families have been grateful to have this opportunity when perhaps it's not a level of risk where we think that the child
Yeah.
would need to be admitted to a hospital, but all of the adults in the child's life want to make sure that that child is really
Sure.
evaluated by a mental health professional and
Right.
deemed to be, you know, safe. So we're very grateful for that, and that.
And actually, the urgent care, we just did the walkthrough today, it's got beautiful new space, so. Even nicer than before, yeah, it's very exciting.
Okay, let me just make sure. I really wanna ask this one, and then did you wanna answer it?
No, I wanted to give them time to ask questions.
Yes, but I do want Nina to answer this one final one. But actually, Dr. Brown, this is exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, I
And
think
this is, what does it mean to fragilize your child or teen, right? And how the parents are really doing that. I wanna hit home this point, I really wanna hit this one home.
I think everybody has kind of already been
Yes.
talking about that, and I think the overarching theme here is that it's with good intention when, parents, guardians, and adults who care about children, when they see a child or an adolescent really in distress, they want to help. And sometimes in the process of helping, we accidentally send the message that the child isn't capable of handling it, or like Dr. Boyer was saying, that the world is dangerous, which is a tricky one right now because I think lots of adults are very anxious about, things in our world. But when you talk about anxiety in general, there's this part about like really viewing everything as a threat and being vigilant and being scared that the world is a dangerous place. So I think sometimes when adults try to intervene or jump in or speak for a child, or if a parent or a guardian hears about an assignment, like you were saying, even something about moving a chair to a different spot, or hearing about an assignment, like public speaking is a big one at the high school where I work. So, just quickly wanting to, the first urge to be to just pick up the phone or email a teacher and just kind of excuse the child from that kind of sends the message that you don't think that the child is capable of, problem solving it on their own. So I know you were talking about space, and I know about a lot of the prompts that I use in my private practice with parents to kind of encourage a child to have independent problem solving. So instead of a child starting to get used to feeling like I can't possibly solve a problem on my own, you just tell me what to do. Like if a child comes home and says, oh no, I'm so worried about this thing, I think a lot of adults want to say, oh don't worry, what you'll say is, here, open up your computer, you'll write this email, instead of, oh, how are you feeling about that? Sounds like you're a little nervous. What were you thinking you might do? Or what would you do if that happened? Or something like that, instead, to kind of encourage the problem solving. Because I think what happens is when somebody starts to feel like they're not capable of handling it on their own and that they need somebody to rescue them, then it also has an impact on how you feel about yourself, like your self-concept. And then that can kind of trickle into some depression and anxiety and self-esteem issues when you don't feel capable. And we can all remember times where we've been really proud that, something was going on and there was a challenge and we figured out our way through, So I think that's kind of like when we talk about fragilizing, it's like that accidental way that we clear the path or we just excuse somebody.
My example that I always give is like, your child's trying to open a jar of pickles and they're struggling with the top. What do? Do you like grab it out of their hand and open it automatically, not even noticing what you just did? Or do you tell them like, what are some other ways that you might go about this, opening this jar of pickles? Like, well, how can we think about it together? Because there's a lot of things that we do like that. We don't even
Automatically.
notice. It's
That's right.
completely
That's right.
automatic.
Yep. Okay, we would like to open it up to some questions. Does anybody have any questions? I have a bunch more, but I would like to open it up to everybody else.
I have a question about validation. Excellent, by the way, really helpful. How long do you validate for? Because when it escalates and it becomes really quite overwhelming, if it can go on for like 40 minutes, like, okay, I think we can move on now. Like, is that even, like, it feels wrong to do that. I never get to 40 minutes, by the way, but like in theory, I know that there's probably, there's only so long that those sorts of sounds and crazy kind of tantrums and things can go on for before you kind of want to shift gears as a parent. I have another kid too, so
Oh, so you're talking about if like you've attempted to show your child, like that you hear them and that you're trying to understand, but that it's not really turning the volume down on the child's emotions. So it's at that point, that's not like an effective strategy. That is not doing that. It's not opening up the lines of communication or something like that. So you don't have to feel badly about shifting to a different strategy. Like it is not doing, I thought you were going to say like in general, validation isn't the only tool. It's kind of the one to get the emotions turned down and to keep the communication going. But in that case, what you're talking about, it doesn't sound like it's doing that in that moment, like that person's kind of at a higher level.
40 minutes is a long time. That is a long time. I feel for you. That is a very long time. I think your point, any kind of interaction you have with somebody has a trajectory, right? So it's either amping up or it's coming down. You should see the coming down relatively quickly, right? I mean, you should just, it's not that everybody's going to be smiling and laughing in 2 minutes, but I think you see that trajectory start to shift. I think
Well, it's
it goes
more
back
sort
to
of
the-
like, I don't know,
like-
like, it's very much like not linear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about the point that you were making also though, sometimes we validate somebody's feelings, but it doesn't mean we're gonna change our behavior.
Yep.
So when the point is made and the kid is heard and the being heard isn't enough because the kid still wants whatever it was, whatever limit you set, at a certain point you do have to move to another strategy, which might have to be something, you know, like active ignoring, which is
Yeah.
also very hard, but when you feel like you're just engaging and engaging and engaging and it's not helping, then it is maybe time to say,
We're helping them even formulate what the problem is and then focusing on the solution instead of the upset. Like, yes, I understand you're upset and let's, move on and talk about what is our problem, what is your problem, right, that you're trying to solve. And if the Xbox is not an option, whatever, that's my example. If that's not an option, well, what else is the option? Like, how else can be, you're upset because you're gonna be bored, you don't know what to do, so can we then switch strategies and go to problem solving together, collaborative problem solving, right? Of like, what can we come up with? That's an alternative. And yeah, active ignoring, sometimes again, it's just sitting with that discomfort. As long as they're safe, right? Like if they're breaking things or they're acting in ways that is unsafe, like again, then you have to, again, switch strategy and set limit and, or maybe even, have a consequence for that or whatnot. But, it's validation alone is often doesn't take them all the way. You do have to mix with other strategies.
On that note, I could just ask,
Yeah.
how detrimental is it, and I can speak professionally and personally with this, is one parent who's great at active ignoring and the other who is not, and it's like a battle.
Yeah.
Like, how much does that hurt the child? Like, what are options there? Because it becomes a big.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard in general, right? Like when we're not on the same page parenting wise, and especially when that's in front of the kids and it's obvious and they do very much know that and they'll take advantage of it, no doubt. So, I mean, in general, it's not that it's detrimental in the sense that it's gonna make you a lot less effective. Working on getting on the same page and setting general rules and then working on, having everybody agree to them as a family sometimes, right? And then having those contracts and negotiations in place to have like a guideline to go by if there's a lot of disagreement about even what the rules should be or, those kind of things. But it's always difficult. Getting on the same parenting page is always really important.
And I guess I would recommend getting on the same parenting page at a separate time.
Yes.
When you're both in a good
Yes.
mood. When things are relaxed and calm, not in the middle of the argument when
Right.
the child is having a crisis, to figure this out beforehand. And maybe you won't be on the same page. Maybe someone says 10 hours of screen time is fine, the other one says no screen time during the week, and then you figure it out. But you figure it out separately. Again, like Dr. Brown said before, all of these, what could be contentious conversations, whether it's between you and your child, you and your spouse, you and whoever else, are most productive when the people who are having the discussion are in a calm, semi-relaxed, not so calm where you're falling asleep, but in an okay mood. To try to solve these things when tensions are high, usually,
Our brains don't
not
work.
very productive. Our brains don't work. Yeah.
Can
In that way.
this is a little weird, but can I circle back to what, it was still sticking in my mind when you were saying
up and
that
down.
idea about the up and down and like an attempt to validate. And I'm just picturing it, and of course, we're not gonna get into, details of personal situations, but I'm picturing too that perhaps it's like, when you were saying this, like this idea that sometimes in an attempt to validate, then you get the child talking, and then when the child starts talking, it's like the emotions rev up again, and then it comes out, and so there's also some value of just sitting silently, and like this is something that I've been reading a lot about lately, like when we learn about like chatter, like the chatter in your own mind, like your own overthinking and stuff, and that there is something to be said to not like continue to talk through the same thing, like Dr. Foyer was saying, like if you're shifting towards like what could be a solution, how are we gonna problem solve this? But I was thinking about that, and when you were talking about this, I was almost picturing that sometimes I think that can happen to all of us. If we're really upset and we start talking about it, we can get upset, and then it can go back down. And then if we start talking about it again, when the person tries to kind of respond, it could maybe lead you to start talking about the same thing over again. So I do think that there's some value for just being with your thoughts and your feelings and just sitting there, and sometimes that eventually gets regulated. Sorry to go back to that. I know that was weird, but it was sitting with it.
We got a cat, so go stroke a cat.
A cat, did you say?
We got a cat, yeah.
Oh, pets help for sure.
Yeah.
It has helped.
Yeah.
Talking stuffed animals helps too. When you make them talk.
Yeah.
However a child will express themselves to you, right? Yeah. We take it.
Does anyone? Yes?
I have two questions. One is, you were talking about accommodating and, you know, and letting them do things on their own. What about when you express your fears, like, oh, you're going on this trip, I'm so happy you're going, but I'm nervous. I'm your mom, I'm scared, I'm worried, but you're gonna have fun. Like, where do you express those feelings to them to let them know, or, you know, and it's okay, because maybe they're a little nervous and you're a little nervous, but it's okay, just go for it, go fly, go do, go this. Or should we be keeping those fears to ourselves and not letting them know so that they don't even think about it? But then they want to stay safe, like, you know, oh, you're going into the city to take a trip? Okay, watch your surroundings, be careful, I'm nervous, you're on the subway, I don't want you there, like, you know, you get afraid as a parent, how much you express to your kid, how much you know, I'm letting you go because I trust you and I think you're gonna do great, but just know I'm on the other end. I'm nervous around.
So what I would,
No, go for it.
yeah. I think it really depends on your goal, right? If your goal is to share your anxiety, I think you can share that with lots of different people. And you have to really think, what is the benefit of telling my kid how nervous I am? If your goal is to prepare for what they're doing and help them think through things that could happen, then you don't actually need to tell them that you're nervous. You can just say, let's talk about what it means for you to be in the city by yourself for the first time. Here are some things that might come up. How do you think you would handle them? I call it the what ifs, right? So without kind of, does that make sense? Do you feel like you have the goal you want without, and then you turn to your best friend and you're like, oh my gosh, she's going into the city for the first time. That's what I'm doing. You know, I think that's the key with anxiety is really just ask yourself what the goal is.
Right. Sometimes the only time that I would say that it's okay to share some of it is if you're trying to, if the goal is showing them how you've conquered it, right? Like to model, like I have been nervous about this thing, and what I do with it is I think through, I come up with solutions, I make backup plans. That's how I deal with my anxiety. And then you're teaching a strategy that they can apply and use. In that case, it's okay. But otherwise, yes, like what Reggie said.
Okay, my second question is, for the older, I guess we didn't know, but in my cases for the older ones, kids are doing so much these days. And they're so worried about their grades, and they're so worried about being on the sports team, they're so worried about being part, you know, into other things. They're already worried about, oh, I have to get all, you know, I have to do this amount of clubs to get to a good college, I have to do this. And there's so much on their plate, and they're so stressed out. How do you know, because then you see these kids in college that, you know, are committing suicide because, and you were like, wow, they were that, like the soccer goalie. I mean, she had an incredible career in life and everything looked beautiful on the outside. How do you, like, if a kid's not expressing that they're sad or upset, like, is there a clue, like, what, you're never sad? Or, like, where do you go if somebody's very quiet about it, but you know that they're stressed?
I mean, I think there's a couple questions in your question, because one is the academic stress and burnout and competition, which is a whole topic that I'm very, very passionate about, and we could go on and on. But I think for that, I think it is really, really important for us to be the voice of reason for our kids, because the pressure and the competition, it's real, it's fierce in many of our, these districts. I'm sure this one's not any different. It's really, on the kids to achieve, and a lot of that, comes internally. A lot of that comes from the peer competition that they're seeing everybody else, and if they're doing it, then I have to do it too, because otherwise how am I gonna have a chance? I think for that it's really important to help our kids, one, to not have this checkbox mentality, to be like, okay, well, if I take this AP and this AP and this thing, then I'm gonna get into the Ivy school and then I'll be set for life, because we know that's not true, and they really need to have an understanding of that is not, because I think a lot of times what happens when these kids push, get to college and then fall apart, because they have no way to cope or deal or be resilient, and because they thought, once we do that, things will be easy, and it's not. So that's one thing. The other thing is like practically breaking it down for them. Like, why are you signing up for this AP class? Evaluating the motivation, how much investment it's gonna take, how much benefit it's gonna bring, and helping them go through the very painful process of evaluating each activity and task, and not just doing it to just do it and to like keep building a resume, but really critically. And these kids are so smart, and they're ready to have these conversations, critically appraised. And again, rather, the really important part of that is teaching them that process. Teaching them that we cannot all do it all. We all have to make painful decisions in life, and that there's a way that you can evaluate and look at what is this gonna bring, how much investment it's gonna be, what it's gonna cost, right? What else I'm not gonna be able to do, how much time I'm gonna spend with this thing that is not gonna allow me to maybe do other things. And that is a very difficult process, but doing that together with them can really help. I'll pass it on. I mean, the second part of your question we can also get back to is like, how do you know when they're quiet?
Yeah, my daughter's a senior in high school, so the question you're asking is so like on point. It's a crazy year, and this idea of deserved and all. I mean, it is really an unhealthy. We got ourselves into a very, very unhealthy place. I will say one of the things that I encourage parents to do when kids come home from a game or from a concert, don't ask how they played. Ask if they had a good time. We've gotten into this like competitive mentality and evaluative, and the literature on this is very, very clear. Self-evaluative stuff messes us up every time, and the comparisons we make messes us up every time. So, that's really an important thing too. Like questions about how your kids' friends are doing academically. I mean, like we really have to.
But this district is what does it. This district is the one
It's not just this district.
our kids.
Many.
Like, it's not even us, it's the district. It's
Yeah, I
crazy.
mean, there are homes that don't do it for sure, and then there are schools that make it worse, and peers that make it worse, and parents that make it worse, and the social media makes it worse. I mean, it's a whole combination of things. If you're a parent who's laid back, God bless you, I'd like to have lunch with you tomorrow, because I've spent the last year with parents who haven't been. The college process, by the way, also makes it worse.
Absolutely, and what, yes. So I do think it's a wider, it's a systemic problem, honestly. And it's really difficult to help our kids kind of get out of that mindset because of the environments that they're in, because the realities, right? Like if somebody, and you don't want them to lose hope, right? Like you don't want to say like, oh, your goal shouldn't be to get into Ivy, that's not what matters, or whatever their goal is, right? They don't want to hear that.
Some of them do. Wait a minute. Some of them do. It depends on the age that you're talking about. And I think isn't the goal more about feeling fulfilled, being happy, having healthy relationships? I mean, I actually think many of the kids don't like the messages that are coming at them at all. So it's really hard. And you're right. They come from multiple sources.
Yeah, I think I go through the college process every year in the guidance department. And what I see is the high level of anxiety, which is expected because they set high goals for themselves. They work really, really hard. My nephew's going through it now. My sister-in-law is like, he just works so hard. He has to get into these 5 schools. I'm like, okay. But what I do see is on the other end, we have an alumni panel every year, and the kids come back, and a lot of say, I didn't get into the first school that I wanted to go to, but I'm so happy where I am. Or my parents made me go to this school because it was cheaper, and I thought I'd be so happy at Cornell, but I'm really happy at Binghamton. It was the right fit for me, and like for the kids to hear those messages where like, you know, yes, shoot for that, but there's so many great schools, and kids do really well there. And we had a girl a couple years ago who wanted to go to a certain Ivy League school, ended up going to a different school, and she comes back every year and she's like, I'm killing it at this school. She feels like she's one of the smart ones there. She's getting all the leadership positions, you know. So it and it really worked out for her. Whereas at the time, it was a crisis situation that didn't get into here. So.
And we haven't even talked about the students at colleges, not their future, and there's other paths, and it's not everybody's future, and it doesn't need to be. And I think that's a really important message too. Really important.
I think that I can see students' faces change sometimes when they're talking about things in a certain way, and I ask, are you the kind of person who thinks there's like a right choice, a right path, and a wrong path? Or are you one of these people who thinks like there's a million different paths, and big on resilience and this idea of like that there's a million different paths and there might be barriers and there's still a way around it. So my dream for this year, and it hasn't happened yet, is to have like an adulting panel of different trusted adults in our school and have kids ask questions about like, did everything go exactly the way you wanted? And kids start to laugh, and you see this like change in their face when I'll tell a few stories about some of my friends who have great lives, and I'll say, what do you think? Do you think that this sounds like a good life? He's got this and this and this and this. Yeah, that sounds like a good life. Well, let me tell you how he got there, and it was this and this and this. And it's like, oh, I'm not gonna fall off this cliff if this one thing that I think is the thing that I need doesn't happen. I think the more kids hear and feel support from their families, that no matter what, there's still a million other pathways around. I think I've seen like a change in kids' faces when we do that sometimes, and that comes back to resilience, getting over barriers.
I forgot the second half of that question.
Oh, the quiet.
What's that?
Oh,
If they're too quiet and they don't express their
Yeah.
feelings,
They're
then
afraid of
hiding
you must be
behind-
depressed, you must be anxious, you can't not
Yeah, like.
be showing
what
it.
if they-
Right.
Yeah, what if they don't have that teen attitude, like, what are other signs that you should be looking for? I mean, I guess like, come home, go if you're really quiet, but things like that.
Yep, there's quiet and there's isolated, right? So we wanna think about what is sort of kids' personality, right? Some kids are just, they go quiet, versus behavior that's of concern, right? Withdrawal. So I think you wanna look within the child that's in front of you and think about what's typical for that child and have they moved outside of what's typical for them. That's what I think, is a general rule of thumb too. Yeah,
And again, just what we said earlier, impact on functioning. Like, are they like that with their friends also? Are they like, really so inactive that they can't do their work? They're not turning in assignments. Their grades are slipping. They have physical aches and pains. Not eating, not sleeping, or eating too much, sleeping too much. Like, those are some other signs that are kind of visible from outside, even when they're not sharing. Which is not atypical, by the way. Kids that are depressed and anxious tend to keep things inside. That's their MO. So it just sort of has to be, sometimes teased out of them. So it's not so atypical that they would be quiet. And I think what you said earlier about them worrying you, especially if you tend to be somebody who worries. Like, I do think that that's often a component. Then, making sure, you seem to have a lot on your mind, and I understand if I'm not the person you want to share it with, do you have somebody in your life that you can talk to, or who do you have, or can we think about it together?
I think that's what you were talking about, those times where you hear like, it looks like everything was
Yeah.
fine, like you never let on anything, like those kinds of ideas scare parents so much. And so I think it's like us being here today and talking about decreasing the stigma to have the conversation, like hey, Mr. Dr. Foyer, like, hey, I just wanted to check in with you, if it's not me that you want to talk to, do you have somebody to talk to, just so that the young adult doesn't think I have to have it all together, because people can't, I don't want to burden people with what's going on, like just
Yeah, so I've been just hearing great information about parents and the impact that parents can have either positively or negatively on their kids' mental health. But with the mental health crisis as a whole, obviously there's a lot of, well, not obviously, I'm asking the question, a lot of other things that are playing into that, whether it's, and I'm curious about those other things, whether it be screens and social media or political stresses that we have in this country, like so much information that kids have access to, like environmental crises, that just like so many. Is it a perfect storm, or do we have enough power to kind of help ease them through these stresses? I guess I just want your comments on all of these different factors that may be playing into the mental health issues.
Sure. I think it's all that. I think it's all of those factors that are playing in. I think one really important thing, it's really not just social media and screens, it's really the way that kids are growing up and developing differently because of it, because we're communicating and functioning differently because of technology, and so do they. And actually the Academy of Pediatrics just released new guidance about how to approach technology, because it really is not about time and not even about, so not quantity and not quality, but they talk about, it's a lot more complex. It's about, where's your child right now? What else does it displace from their life? What else they're not doing because they're doing technology? How does it impact communication, relationships with other people, in-person relationships, all of these other factors that are a lot more important, we're finding, in terms of how that impacts kids. So I do think it's, I think we always think that in many ways it is very difficult for kids these days, and in many ways their lives improved tremendously compared to in the past. So in many ways we think they're the most unsafe, and they really are physically probably the safest. I do think one of the biggest things that they are the amount of information that their brain processes from a very, very young age, I think is having a really profound impact in the way they regulate emotion, the way they focus and concentrate, the way they learn, and it's impacting on things. But with that being said, I do think that I am not hopeful, and I do think that a lot of those things, as these environments around us are changing, we are learning how to deal with that and how to live in that, and we are learning how to parent in that and how to help our kids adapt. And it's really important for us to not fight and be against all of it, because we can't change the course of climate change, of technology, of politics, and all of these other things, right? It's beyond our control, but it is in our control, and I think this helps with our anxiety also, focusing on what we can control and can do, and that is all of what we're talking about. It's how we approach these problems and how we equip our kids with the skills that they need to continue to stay resilient and be able to cope with whatever comes their way.
Just to jump off, I know you feel the same way as me about this. Everything that you were just saying, I 100% agree with, and I think it's related, but social connection, we're talking about electronics, but, and like what you said, like what are children doing instead when they're on technology? But I know Dr. Boyer and I have spoken about this a number of times, but I don't think it's a coincidence that if you look at certain data out there, there's, social connection is a protective factor for mental health issues and for anxiety and for depression. It's how we get validation and support and help when we need it. And all of the statistics are showing that before COVID, the social engagement and social connections and friendships and relationships with family and others have been steadily decreasing. And then there's some bit of data that in 2012, when smartphones really took off, we saw even more of a decline in social connection. So I think, again, this is something that's still under our control to really make it, it's my top priority in terms of the wellness center at my school. Connection is the #1 thing we're trying to do, because it is such a protective factor. factor. And it's like one of the strongest predictors of a happy, fulfilling, satisfying life. So when we're talking about colleges and AP classes and test grades, like every once in a while the parents of my clients in my private practice will be like, did you really tell my son that like research shows that like your GPA does not predict happiness, or the college you got into does not predict happiness? And I'm like, yeah, I did, because it's true. So the number one predictor of a fulfilling life are, the qualities of your relationships with other people. So I feel like that's another factor right now that's upsetting and something that we can address, change social connection.
Is there any other questions? I have one final one. So I guess each of you, if you have any specific recommendations that you would have for parents whose kids might be crazy sometimes or have bad days, maybe more than a parent thinks they should, do you have any recommendations or resources that you would recommend to parents, whether they be outside of the school or even within the school? Do you have any recommendations?
I mean, resources we talked about in the hospital, so that those services are available. My recommendation in general would be is that if you are somebody whose child often has a difficult time, make sure you make time to have fun with them, and that you are able to get curious about they have fun with and do it. Even if you don't want to learn about Minecraft or whatever, like do it and play with them and enjoy them, because that shared joy and fun will really help both of you in terms of being able to endure the difficult times.
I strongly agree with that. There are some wonderful resources online about things, like how to listen more actively to your kid, so I would encourage you to reach out there. We didn't talk at all about my work, which is totally fine, but I do run a trauma clinic at St. John's University. So if a child is having a really hard time because they've been through something traumatic, we offer actually free services to kids who've been through personal violence, natural disaster, motor vehicle collisions, all of the things that cause post-traumatic stress. So Jolie certainly can access my work if any of you need that. There's a clinician in the back who was trained by me years ago, so she might be taking referrals, what do I know? But feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, because that is a crisis moment and those things happen. And I'm very, very comfortable talking about the impact of that.
I love, that's a great resource, and I love what you said about having fun. And I guess just in terms of resources as a school-based, school psychologist, I would say that it's a great resource to partner with your school when you're wondering, is this a crisis or is this just a bad day, and how is my child functioning in a setting when I'm not there to see it? Or if your child is starting to really want to escape or avoid things, the mental health professionals and counselors at the school could really be that support to start inching towards approaching rather than avoiding. So really to partner with schools, I think, is a great resource.
Nina took my answer.
Oh.
That's right. We created a wellness webpage during COVID that's on our website. If you go to the counseling webpage, and it has calming strategies on there, links to the website, so it's a good resource.
Okay, any final questions? Okay, I think that about wraps it up. Thank